NATO has warned Russia against any further aggression after a buildup of its military forces were spotted at Ukraine's border in recent weeks. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg, who met Ukraine's foreign minister in Brussels today, added that the Western military alliance is standing by Ukraine. Kyiv says that Russia has been actively building up forces on its border since spring.
What we see is a significant, large Russian military buildup. We see an unusual concentration of troops, and we know that Russia has been willing to use these types of military capabilities before to conduct aggressive actions against Ukraine. This is partly forces close to the border between Russia and Ukraine, but it's also partly troops and capabilities which are inside Ukraine, meaning that they are in Crimea, which is illegally annexed, and also we see the militants, the separatists in Donbass, which is also part of Ukraine, supported and helped by Russia.
And joining me now is Ian Bond, Director of Foreign Policy at the Centre for European Reform, and he's also a former UK ambassador to Latvia. Thank you so much there, Mr. Bond, for joining us here on Euronews Tonight. The EU is obviously quite focused now on what's happening there at the border between Poland and Belarus. But do you think that the West is missing what's happening with this Russian buildup of troops near the Ukraine border?
Well, that's clearly the risk, although obviously, as we've just heard from the NATO Secretary General, NATO is keeping a close eye on this. And I think that the Americans also last week had meetings with the Ukrainians, and Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, had meetings with the Russians, which apparently also covered this issue. So somebody is paying attention to this. What does slightly worry me is that I'm not hearing the same level of interest from most of the European countries.
Lithuania's foreign minister, Gabrielius Landsbergis, he has told reporters that he fears a possible attack from Russia on Ukraine now that the EU's focus is on the border issue there between Belarus and Poland. Do you agree that that might happen?
Yeah, I don't think it's likely, but I think it's not outside the realms of possibility. And I think Mr. Landsbergis is exactly right to draw attention to that as a risk. You know, Vladimir Putin is very good at taking opportunities when they're offered. And when your adversaries are distracted by what actually doesn't amount to more than a few thousand migrants on the borders with Poland and others, which, by the standards of the numbers who are received every day in Italy and other places on the southern side of Europe, is not many. That may be a great opportunity to do something towards Ukraine, or against Ukraine, I should say.
Now, Russia has denied any kind of involvement in this current migrant crisis there on the border between Poland and Belarus. But what do you think that Putin's goal is here? Is it to take over Belarus in the end?
I'm slightly skeptical that he actually wants to take over Belarus. I know that this has been a worry for a very long time, and it's a worry which actually Lukashenko himself has used against the West, in the sense of saying, well, if you're horrible to me, then I will have no alternative but to turn to Putin. But it seems to me that actually Putin would have to take on the responsibility for Belarus, which is in quite a mess economically. It suits him better to have a weak, dependent Lukashenko who will, do his bidding to some extent, be an erratic player on the European scene, but, for whom he doesn't have to pay 100% of the bills.
But how far do you think, though, that Putin is ready to sort of support Lukashenko as the president, given the current state of play, what's happening there on the border, for example, and the very frosty relations between the EU and Belarus?
Well, I'm sure that Putin wants Lukashenko to stay in office. There was some speculation at the very beginning of this crisis, when Lukashenko's rigged election took place, that Putin would actually prefer to have a different candidate in that seat. But that's not really been Putin's way of operating. I mean, he has tended to support the strong man in place But, as with Assad in Syria, to make sure that they recognize that they are dependent on his goodwill. And I think that may well apply to Lukashenko. Is he going to go to war with the West for the sake of a few thousand migrants on the border with Poland? I rather doubt that. That's a much more serious gamble. And I think if we headed in that direction, then I think Putin would, in fact, rein in Lukashenko.
Ian Bond from the Foreign Policy at the Centre for European Reform, director there. Thank you so much there, Mr. Ian Bond, for joining us on Your News Tonight.